In this video, we're going to take a look at how Kegan stage 3, spiral dynamics stage blue, and Loevinger's conformist or diplomat stage are similar and different, at least according to me, and what we might learn about human beings and their psychology based upon that. Again, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. So here it starts getting interesting. We don't quite find the same similarities here than we do in the previous stage. So let's start with Kegan again, because it's easier there because his model is more concerned with structure than with themes and motives and personality tendencies, if you will. So remember that in the previous stage, the person was subject to their enduring interests and perceived needs and agendas. Now the person has begun to take those as objects and subordinate those interests in service of being part of something bigger, usually some group identity. This is why it's called a socialized mind. The person becomes socialized in the sense that society, or at least parts of society, becomes part of him, and he becomes part of society. This might be a religious group, this might be a sports team, it might be some sort of political ideology, could be a combination of those things. What we now do is that we internalize shoulds and values and beliefs and expectations and norms from some ideology or group of significant others, and we kind of co-construct our sense of self based upon how well we seem to be living up to these ideals. There's a lot of benefits to this. One is that instead of it being me against the world, it's now us against them in a sense, you know, instead of it's a more ethnocentric way of living for the most part. It's my group, you know, my church, my nation state, my political team against the others. And usually the others differences are threatening for the most part at this stage of development. But what I can do now is I can be a loyal team player. I can be part of something bigger than myself. I can be devoted to a larger cause. Um, and this brings a lot of benefits. You know, relationships, instead of being exploitative and kind of tit for tat, now become more about what we feel for each other. There's the possibility of a more shared intimacy, which makes life deeper and better. Um, Now, spiral dynamics, you know, Graves, what he called DQ, and spiral dynamics blue, they have this very specific version of this where it's the theme of, remember that the previous system, red, was express self now impulsively to hell with others. Now it's sacrifice self to gain reward later. So remember that Graves did his research starting in the early 50s in the United States, and Christianity has a stranglehold on the United States. And so it's no wonder that the university students would get socialized into that sort of ideology. So, you know, now you have the saintly sacrifice now to get reward in the afterlife. You get the capacity for guilt because now it's like, am I being a good Christian? If I'm not living up to that, then that changes how I experience myself. Um, But here's where this kind of goes wrong in a sense. So let me read something interesting, and this is from Clare Graves' book again, The Never Ending Quest. Listen to this. The individual absorbs self into the group and in essence becomes the group. But this is Graves' description of the FS system, or what spiral dynamics call green. But this is a perfect description of Kegan's socialized mind. So what Kegan describes as the socialized mind, Graves and spiral dynamics describe as FS, or the green system. Now remember that FS and green is 2 stages later than blue. It's then orange and ER, and then into FS, right? Or the green system. So this is a problem. This is a place where this doesn't add up. And I remember very early when I studied spiral dynamics, I live in Norway. I've lived here almost all my life, and Christianity does not have a such a strong foothold here anymore. Religion doesn't in general, unless you're part of the Muslim population. They tend to do that strict Islamic thing. But if you grow up in Norway today, there's more a socialization often into these progressive left-wing type values. People might become environmentalists or feminists or multiculturalists or wanting to save the environment, or they might adopt some sort of woke ideology where they see racism and sexism everywhere, right? But they're holding it in that kind of absolutistic, ethnocentric, black and white kind of thinking way. They're not relativistic thinkers, right? So I think that spiral dynamics Graves way of conceptualizing it is perfect for a traditional society. If you look at traditional societies, if you look at the epistemology, there's very often a supernatural source, and that's the metaphysics and the epistemology, how we know through faith. And we receive information from imams and priests or sages and prophets. And there's a strict order and hierarchy of things, right? So whether you look at the Islamic world, much of the Christian world, or the kind of old communist states, whether it's China or it's the old Soviet Union or Cuba or East Germany, I mean, different at the level of content, but the same kind of blue system. So I think Graves was dead on. Like in traditional societies, that spiral dynamics way of conceptualizing it likely hits home. But today, where people live in more modern societies, people might internalize different ideologies and become socialized into different groups. It might even be a kind of postmodern, hyper relativistic, nothing's true, and you don't have to self reflect about anything type ideology, but held in a kind of more absolutistic way with not that much nuanced thinking. Or it might be a question everything type ideology, or it could be a right wing ideology. If you look at Nazi Germany, back in the day, or it would be more likely to call it a collectivist ideology. But even I think, when the spiral dynamics folks talk about orange or the ER system, they very often talk about capitalism, and they talk about Ayn Rand and her book Atlas Shrugged and Objectivism as a Philosophy. And yes, Ayn Rand definitely um, was an example of that orange system. And she would definitely be a great example of Kegan's self-authoring mind, or Loevinger's achiever stage for sure. But simultaneously, I think if you look at many of her followers, many of them internalized the philosophy of Ayn Rand and tried to be a independent, autonomous person as defined by Ayn Rand, right? So I think what you very often saw here was more of that, what they in ego development call the expert stage, or that kind of mid zone between the socialized mind and the self-authoring mind, or even the socialized mind sometimes, trying to be an independent person as defined by Ayn Rand. If you're socialized into a culture that, for example, markets free speech and capitalism and property rights, and that's what you internalize, you might express that through a more socialized mind. It's not necessarily a sacrifice self way of doing it. And I think this is one of the benefits really of Kegan's model of concerning itself solely with structure, is that you see that spiral dynamics way of conceptualizing it, yeah, it seems spot on for traditional societies, but I would claim that it's one way to essentially do this socialization process. And if someone, grows up in a more modern society, they might express that or live that with a very different set of values or themes, but the very structure underlying it might be the same. Now, um, ego development, calls this the conformist stage or the diplomat stage. I think Torbert came up with that term, or even the group centric stage. And here you have a way of conceptualizing it again, that your identity is fused with some sort of group that you're kind of overly identified with. And if the group is successful, then you can feel great, right? So there's often an emphasis on positivity, not rocking the boat, being diplomatic, being nice, being pleasant, impressing the neighbors, having status symbols, these sorts of things, and holding oneself kind of simultaneously over responsible and under responsible, right? But I also think that Kegan's stage three, or socialized mind, seems to point to a bit more internal complexity or subjectivity than what Loevinger describes as the conformist, with these more simple internal states with not that much nuance or differentiation. At least that's at least that's how I read it. Now, one area where I kind of disagree with all of these developmentalists is I think that way more people operate here, I think, in the Western world than I think they overestimate how many people truly move beyond this stage. If you look back to the various experiments done in academia, on obedience, the Solomon Asch experiments, the Stanford Zimbardo prison experiment, the Milgram experiments, you look these up if you're not familiar with them. You see staggering amounts of good Germans or obedience all over the place. The Milgram studies got like 64 to 67%, I think, compliance rates. Got often higher rates than that in Europe. Milgram spent a year in Norway and a year in Paris and was disappointed in the Norwegians because he had expected Vikings. And what he found was a bunch of conformists who had even higher rates than the Americans and almost as high rates of obedience as the Germans. Now, there have been done obedience tests in more recent times, and we seem to be just as obedient, right? This is in the academic setting. If you have Netflix, I urge you to watch a show called Don't Pick Up the Phone. It's this documentary about this swindler who calls, people who work at these fast food joints and persuades them that he's a police officer and that one of the people who work there has done something bad, and instead of coming to the police station, they can do this over the phone. And he essentially persuades these managers to be violent and to sexually assault these, you know, people who haven't done anything. And the compliance rate is just staggering in state after state after state, right? Here you see the downside of this socialized mind. And this is outside of academia. And then, of course, you have the whole COVID spectacle. And if you look in the West at how quick most Westerners were to emulate a totalitarian dictatorship, which is China, the Chinese Communist Party, and how we essentially obeyed the WHO and the big pharmaceutical companies and the career politicians, and how people snitched on their neighbors, and how families got torn apart based upon who wore masks and who didn't. Now, a lot of this too, I think, was very tribal. If people leaned to the left, they would follow all the COVID stuff. And some of the more conservative people, would not. I don't think there was that much that people necessarily knew that much about the science or the research, but it was more like a tribal thing, right? But if you look at that whole COVID experiment from the perspective of obedience to authority and that kind of socialized form of mind, I think that's a great real life example that shows that this form of mind, I think, is way more prevalent than the academic studies tend to suggest. And even in general, just how few people are willing to rock the boat. I'll give you a final example from law enforcement. There was this case in Norway a few years ago called the Monica case, where an 8-year-old girl had been murdered. Now, initially, the police concluded that it was a suicide, that she had hung herself. But it was one detective who didn't even work the case who looked at that and said, the window smashed, her cell phone is gone, she wasn't depressed, she's 8 years old, hung herself, this doesn't make sense, I don't accept this conclusion. And he started investigating, and his chief threatened to fire him. He was ostracized. This was in a big city on the west coast called Bergen. It's the second largest city in Norway, or at least that district. And he cracked the case and discovered that it was her stepfather, or the mother's boyfriend, who didn't have an alibi after all, and got the evidence, and it was a clear case. But until that happened, he was ostracized by virtually all of his colleagues. His chiefs tried to fire him. He wrote in his book about it that he had virtually no friends at the police station, and everyone would just conform. And then he was able to get outside higher authority to join him in reopening the case. And when that happened, he suddenly got super popular, and everyone wanted to be his friend, right? And that's the groupthink. And then the sloppy detective, or the chief who had threatened to fire him, she got promoted to a higher position, which was probably the system's way to say fuck you to the individual who dared to challenge the conventions. Anyways, I hope you found this somewhat stimulating. In the next episode, we're going to look at uh, Clare Graves, ER system, spiral dynamics, orange, ego development, conscientious or achiever stage, and Kegan's stage 4, the institutional self or self authoring mind. Till then, take care. Hope to see you there.